it's at that I have contention, because I think God is intimately intertwined with the proceedings of moment to moment.
Gotcha. And that brings up an interesting point. The deists basically, like you said, they wound up God winds up the toy and he leaves us to our own business. We determine whatever we want to do, or whatever happens. But you're saying God continues along in our journey. What would you say that his will is in the moment? What do you think his will is for human beings? Or
Well,
where do you define?
It's not a matter of question. It's a matter of just simply observing that this internet connection is being maintained, and let me rephrase this: that any physical causation, as so long as the world remains lawful, we know that something non-physical is taking place. And that if we can arrive at the conclusion that the world was created and created by God, then the non-physical reality that commands and dictates this world is not a passive thing. Time is best understood in a dynamic way, not a linear way. The passage of time is the measurement of stuff happening, not what a clock says. That's a human conception of time, so we don't miss our tea time at 6:30 after work. So to say, I guess I'll leave it at that God rather is a moment-to-moment thing. And I think what you're coming at here is, in the Christian idea, Christianity has this notion of what we ought to do versus what we ought not to do. And there's this path that leads us towards God, or a path that leads us away from God. And the way I understand it is that begins and ends really with ethics, and non-Christian ethics, or simply classical ethics, begin and end with observing what is real. And if we start talking about ethics, then that's fine. But
we can stay away from that. Well, my question to you is, if you can fathom that God goes past the point of winding the clock and he's in the day to day, are you limiting God's interaction in the day to day to only keeping our environment stable? You don't think God has any concern with how we behave, or any such things like that? Or do you feel that
no,
I don't want to get off into a moral tangent, but do you feel that God is only concerned with maintaining the quote unquote fishbowl we live in, and you feel that he draws a line, he's not worried about how we behave or sin, quote unquote? I mean, how do you draw the line on this, on his interaction, or what he's concerned with?
Right. Sin is understood even in the Christian idea as the will of man that does not coincide with the will of God. To say that something exists is to say that it is the will of God, whether it's good, whether it's evil, whether it's in between. In that, then, is where I draw an understanding of ethics, in that it begins and ends with correct premises. That if you are going to have an exchange with an individual, any deliberate action is going to take a premise, just like any logical conclusion. And if that premise is right, then the action is right. If the premise is wrong, then the resulting action is wrong. And in that, ethics merely becomes a classification of deliberations that a human being can have. And that's slightly different from what most Christians take it as, is to say, there's like the holy life. There's this path that we have to follow, and it is as the Bible prescribes. What rather I would suggest for people who are seeking God to do is to look rather at logic and their own intuitive sense of what the world is and what it is not, and so on and so forth, and arrive at the proper holy life that way.
Gotcha. Do you think, in a sense, do you think that God kind of leaves this ethical mechanism, he winds that up and lets that thing take its course, or do you think he further progresses with that?
No,
because it sounds like you're saying we can figure out our own ethics, and I don't mean our own ethics, but that's left to our own devices as well. Or do you think, and that's kind of almost like a deist take, like we have this thing called ethics, and God allows us to sort that out, and he doesn't go any further? Or do you think God goes even a little further than that, and he's in the ethical framework as well, and he's involved with what we do and what we
Anything
don't do,
that
what we should
exists,
do?
he's involved in. Anything that exists only exists because he's involved with it. It's
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So he's not involved with sin or
anytime you talk about a wind-up toy, that's not what I'm saying. Anything separate, because that separates maker from making, and no.
Okay, let me just squeeze this in really quick. I'm sorry to interrupt. Okay, if there is no separation between him and what he's made, when you look at the history of human beings, and this is just reality, human beings screw each other over. I mean, we've done so many vile things. You don't think God has any kind of say or interest in that?
Say or interest?
He doesn't address that.
No, his interest, he wouldn't. I mean, the idea of interest would only exist if he had some sort of goal. But if he's omnipotent, he would not fathomably have a goal or any such desire. Since anything like if you or I have a goal or a desire or a teleological point in the future, it's because we recognize that we're limited in some way now. If you want to put limitation on God, then that's for you and the Christian movement to decide. I do not do that. I don't think there is a teleological point, and I do not think God is limited in such a way.
Well, it's not saying that he's limited. I'm asking do you think he takes an interest, or does he only go that far and he lets the ethical mechanism, he lets us sort that out, and he takes no bother or interest in how we behave towards each other?
I mean, he is the only reason ethics exists.
Okay.
But it's not so much that he is like the teacher at the front of the classroom giving points to each of us as we follow the rules. It's rather he wrote the rules are there, and the rules are understood logically through human intuitions. And that's just the end of it. There's nothing more or less that needs to happen for us to conduct our lives in a moral way. And that is to say, in the way God intended.
Okay. Well, in a way that still sounds kind of like a deistic. He kind of.
Well,
we have this rough idea of what ethics are.
Let's call that then. What if I was a deist? What would that then mean for you?
Well, that's what I'm trying to feel out what your position is exactly, and I'm more or less now. I'm just curious. I don't mean to. I'm just trying to feel out how you view things. To me, it seems like if God only goes so far as to this ethical mechanism, which we get from him, and he proceeds no further, and you have a situation where I remember I read this story a little while ago about this guy who broke into this house. He kidnapped, there was a family of 4. He killed the parents, and he took the 2 youngest with him out in the woods. It was an 8-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy and their brother and sister. He raped them, and he set the brother on fire in front of his sister and basically watched him die. And the girl ended up escaping, and that was pretty much how that went. But I'm saying to say that God he proceeds to the day-to-day activities, and we have these ethics we get from him, but he has no interest in something like that happening. I'm trying to understand how that follows. Like,
how can you set someone on fire if there is no God to create the law in which someone can be set on fire?
Well, I understand that, but I'm saying he has no interest.
Is not something that is heartwarming. Mm-hmm. It is something that rather exists. It's something that just is, and it is there. I recognize and I empathize and sympathize and every other thighs word with Christians who prescribe the notion of God as something comforting. What I find comforting is merely to be in the knowledge of what exists and not be under delusion. Now, in that, if God exists, then, and if the causal laws, this is going to sound terrible, if the causal laws that are in place are his will, then setting children on fire or any other diabolical thing is as well.